So I'm going to be talking about West Africa's cultural legacy. The main people that passed down the legacy were often what's called griots, which are record keepers. They're similar to Greeks and Romans, how they had people who would pass down the oral history from generation to generation. These weren't like modern day stories where things get twisted from person to person, but rather the people in charge of these stories often would have to memorize specifics and make sure that they had it straight. So they would pass it on from one person to the next, from generation to generation. They had so much wisdom that they would often talk for hours or even days. They'd be used for advisors to rulers at the time. One such ruler was this man by the name of Sunjata Keita, who was the first king of Mali. Um, and stories of him are still told even today. Um, and again, Mali was the culture that took over after Ghana had fallen. The Mundai people became the Empire of Mali. Another big part of the griots' responsibilities were for telling folk tales. So these are things that often would get passed among the community. So, for example, when slavery happened and slaves were brought to the United States, one of the main things that they brought over were stories about rabbits or hares. One of these famous stories that you may or may not have heard of is Friar Rabbit. Particularly, he was made into a cartoon for American culture. Folktales, even though they were fiction, were also used for moral or value purposes to teach children about the way that they should go and what they should do, things they should and shouldn't do. Also, another huge part with the griots was similar to how rabbis in Jewish culture and Christian culture, ancient Christian culture, had to recite and memorize things word for word, especially things that they considered holy. Same thing with the Islamic culture, is they had to also memorize things. However, when Muslim influence became big, they began writing in Arabic, and writing became another form of passing down their culture from generation to generation, which they still continue to add to their libraries today. Music and dance has also been a huge part of West African legacy. It has a huge impact on our culture today, as things like, for example, jazz and rock and rap and hip hop and stuff all have roots in West African music, and the dances associated with them have roots in West Africa as well. At least a lot of them do. Three of the main instruments used in West Africa were the bellophon, the ngoni, and the kora. The bellophon was the main instrument used by the griots. The ngoni and the kora both were made of different things, but the latter two even included fishing lines. And again, music and dance both have been brought throughout the world due to slavery, and not just here in North America, but also in South America, in Cuba, and other places throughout the world. So dance and song were used for different things, such as celebratory purposes, like for marriages, and even when kids would lose their first tooth, stuff like that. But they were also used for religious purposes. It was a way to commune with spirits and dead ancestors. It was also just a part of their everyday life. The masks that they made, often out of wood, had a representation at times. So, for example, if they were forest people who believed in being more free, they might, for example, make a mask that was of a wild animal in order to represent that. Another huge part of music and dance is the call and response. So, for example, if you've ever seen a football game, how sometimes they'll say, "Whose house is this?" And then the response is, "Our house." And then they keep doing that over and over again. That's an example of call and response. Another huge part of West African cultural legacy was their art. So terracotta was their first art form that they would use to make sculptures and stuff, which was a type of clay sculpture. Then in about the 11th century, they moved on to making bronze and copper sculptures. And then in the 16th century, they moved on to making brass sculptures, which they then taught one of their neighbors to make brass as well, or to use brass in their art. Now, they also used wood to make things like masks for religious purposes, as stated before, to represent various different things, such as rulers, or famous people, or the gods, stuff like that. It even inspired a famous painter who was from Spain by the name of Picasso. Now, the different types of fabric that they used were called, there was three main ones: stamped fabric, which they used dye for; story fabric, which essentially told a story; and kente cloth, which was made of mostly like silk and other cloth materials that were woven together in different patterns. The story fabric is similar to Hmong culture, how they have story blankets, which is like a quilt, or story quilts, which is a quilt that tells a story essentially. It usually has some kind of pictures in Hmong culture. The kente cloth, however, would often represent different things, such as a person's history, or their political standing, social status, stuff they were going through in life, things like that. They also made things art-wise that would be useful for everyday life, such as their coil making, which they used for making things like baskets. The coil would be wrapped so tight sometimes that they could even use it to hold water, which is really similar to Native American basket weaving as well. Now, another thing that's pretty crazy about the griots was that they also would even know, because there was one griot per village and community, and they would often even know the history of every single member of that community and their genealogy, which means their family line. So that's pretty much, in a nutshell, West African cultural legacy.